want to talk about this morning is grief. Seems a bit strange to be in such a gorgeous spot and be called to talk about grief, but that's what came up as I was meditating and soaking in the hot springs early this morning. And I think it might have to do, sun's just peeking up over the mountains, check it out. I think it might have to do with the fact that Joy and I just left Phoenix, where we were staying. We were literally staying in my biological mother's granny unit on the property she shares with my biological brother and his wife. And most of the grief from this lifetime that I've been clearing, healing, processing, letting go of really has been around the wound of adoption, the wound of abandonment. And it seems appropriate that this first day out is a good day to explore grief. Because one of the things that I've found is that the more I allow myself to feel the grief, the more it heals. One of the first times that I allowed myself to experience grief was in 1999. Up until then, I had been pretty much numb to all the grief I carried. It was just too overwhelming to experience the pain of that wound. And I was taking a 6-month training with Malidoma Somé and Francis Weller on indigenous wisdom, indigenous ritual. And in one of the first weekend gatherings, we did a grief ritual. And I remember you kind of dance. It's based on the West African tradition of Malidoma Somé, and there's lots of dancing and singing and drumming. It's super fun. But the idea is that you're supposed to be grieving, and there was an altar set up for us all to go up when we were ready and grieve, and then we come back into the village and get welcomed back. And I remember people going up and crying and yelling and screaming and wailing and crying and sobbing, and I was there singing and doing the chanting and dancing and being like, what is going on with these people? Like, not feeling any grief, like just feeling nothing, and realizing now that I was just numb, and kind of looking around and realizing we're getting towards the end. Like, I'm one of the last people who still hasn't gone up to the altar, and I'm like, am I gonna get in trouble if I don't go up to the altar? Starting to judge myself for doing it wrong. And so I go on up. I'm like, all right, I'll just go on up. And I'm sitting there at the altar, still nothing, still no feeling. And then I heard kind of an inner voice, kind of a fake it till you make it. Just like fake grief, fake cry, pretend that you're feeling grief. And so I started, but I wasn't smiling. Or maybe I was, I don't remember. But it started like, and then it worked. Strangely enough, it worked. It started to open up the channel for grief to, ow, that was kind of pokey. I'm walking off the trail here. And I started feeling grief, and then all of a sudden, it really opened up. And I went into this abyss, literally like a black hole it felt like. And I was like, holy fucking shit, I am never getting out of this. It literally felt like I was never going to come out of that black hole of grief. And I didn't know what to do. But I trusted enough in the process and the formula of that ritual tradition, and I let the grief come, and it came, man. It just frickin' came and kept coming. But the interesting thing is that at some point I just kind of realized it wasn't grief anymore. It was joy. It was like somewhere in there it had shifted, and I didn't even notice. There was this shift from this deep, cathartic letting go of the grief, and then all of a sudden I realized, like, oh my gosh, this is what real joy feels like. And I realized in that moment, yeah, I had never felt grief, and I had also never really felt joy. Like real, deep joy. And at the time I was like, oh shit, I can't. I wanted to just laugh. And I was like, oh, I can't at the altar. So but I could in the village. That's the idea. Now I realize that that's what happens. You do your grieving at the altar, then you go back to the village, and it's like this welcoming celebration, joyful dancing, drumming, singing, chanting. And it's such a beautiful formula for how to let go of grief. And such a beautiful, powerful process. And since that time I've done many, many, many grief rituals, and what I've learned is that you peel away the layers, in layers. It's not all at once. I was like, in that moment, I was probably like, oh, yay, I'm done. I let go of grief. No. There's always more. But the beautiful thing, and recently, this was corroborated when I was reading a couple books that I read that helped me understand this process. Because every time I've done grieving rituals, grief rituals, or breath work, or rebirthing, or working with the medicine, and gone deep, deep, deep into grief or anger or, some emotion, it always ends, no matter how deep and overwhelming and all encompassing it feels, it always ends. And I read Michael Singer's Living Untethered, amazing book. And he talks about that process of how as you open to emotions, he calls it the Shakti force comes up, and you don't have to go looking for it, which I've come to understand. You never have to go looking for the emotions. If you're open, life force, Shakti force is going to come up through you and activate the places in you where you're holding, where you're blocking, where you're resisting. And when it hits those places, it's going to bring up emotions. And your job, when that happens, is just to allow it. You don't have to do anything. And in that allowing, it will release. And David Hawkins, in his book, Surrender, it's either Letting Go or Surrendering, he specifically says that grief lasts 20 minutes. If you can be with grief for 20 minutes and let it be, it goes away. It's like that's how long it needs for that layer of grief to go. And, I've never like timed it with a stopwatch, but that's been my experience, that it's about 20 minutes. Like, that's about how long, when I've been in grief rituals, that I've been at the altar before I'm like, okay, I'm done. This round, this layer of grief is now done. When I've led grief rituals and held sacred space for people to let go of emotions, and when I've been in those containers, 20 minutes is about how long people spend at the altar. And then they're done. That layer of grief or anger or sadness or frustration or whatever it is, 20 minutes is about how long it takes to let it go. Now, in that 20 minutes, there are definitely moments where it feels like this is never going to end. This will never end. This grief will never go away. It is going to swallow me, encompass me, destroy me, dissolve me. And in some ways it is. That's the idea. You're allowing yourself to be dissolved by the experience so that the experience can dissolve, so that the stored energy, Michael Singer talks about Samskaras. It's an Indian idea that the wounds we carry from this lifetime and from past lifetimes are stored in our physiology and in the energy physiology, in the physical cells of the structure, the cells of the body, as well as the energetic flows, the meridians, the channels. And the samskaras are where the energy gets blocked, where the flow gets blocked. And when Shakti comes up and hits one of those blocks, hits one of those samskaras, it activates that energy. And that energy activates as emotion, usually. It can also activate as physical symptoms. But ideally, if we catch it as emotion and let the emotion come up, be with the emotion long enough to let it go, then that samskara, which is a holding, releases, it dissolves. The next time you feel grief come up, see if you can be with it for 20 minutes and report back if it lets go. I think you will find that it does. It's pretty amazing when you've been in this space of feeling like, oh, this is never going to end, and then all of a sudden, poof, it just goes away, just lets go. All right, peace out.